Systems check. Boop, boop, doop, doop, doop. We're looking pretty good. Y'all want to go back in time with me?
Yes.
Sure.
Okay. This tram will serve as a time machine for the next 45 minutes to an hour as we rediscover the lives of the ancient peoples who started living here by about 3,700 years ago. And over a span of about 600 years, as far as we can tell so far, they built the largest community in North America, the largest mounds and earthworks, and the largest exchange network for their time. Okay, the site, as we call it today, is Poverty Point World Heritage Site. But we have no idea what the ancient people called their site or what they called themselves. So why do you think that is?
No written record.
No written records, right? So if you think about it, we would call this a prehistoric site instead of a historic site. And because of this, historians don't have a narrative. Instead, we have to rely on a very different discipline. And you can see some of it today. We just did a little photo op with our archaeologists as they wrap up their field work that they've been doing for the last month. Okay? So the dirt tells the story. The artifacts tell the story. But it's like a connect the dots puzzle. You ever done one as a kid or as an adult?
Yes.
What happens if you miss 90% of the dots?
Then your pattern will not connect.
Don't know
The
what
pattern will
picture's
not
gonna
connect. So in a lot of ways, the pattern does not connect because they abandoned this landscape about 3,000 years ago. And a lot of those dots have gone missing through either natural or man-made processes. So we're going to discover the site as we best know it today, okay, and that can change over time as we do more archaeology, through this really important lens. Y'all ready?
Yes.
Yeah. I'm Ranger Mark. I'm going to be taking you around today. Make sure you stay seated at all times. Keep all your arms, legs, fingers, and toes inside the tram, and we will have a fun and a safe ride. Have y'all ever seen an empty grassy field before?
Yes, sir.
Do they look exciting?
Yeah.
Okay. I like your optimism. I think they look boring. Because we get used to these sorts of surfaces.
Wow.
But what if I told y'all, when you drove in on the highway and you pulled into the visitor center, you were driving on something artificial, something that was man-made. And it's not necessarily just the road itself. We're at a part of this ancient site that we call the plaza today. Okay. And the plaza is a constructed space. We find evidence that the ancient people brought in about 175,000 cubic yards of earth to fill in this area. So if you'd measure the artificial dirt at any given place in the plaza, on average, we find about a meter of fill, which is like 3.3 feet. That's pretty wild. That's the amount of dirt, about 3/4 the amount of the dirt that it took to build Mound A, which is the really, really big one over there. So that's very, very neat stuff. And pardon me one moment. I'm noticing an issue with the tram here. I'm going to call over Ranger Ethan. He's going to bring us a little golf cart. That's how we're going to get around the rest of the way, I think, while I work on this. Sorry about that, y'all. The break is out. This is an artificial space. We've only really begun to examine how artificial it is. We've been sampling different parts of this 43-acre plaza using soil cores, using excavations, and you'll see some excavations covered up right over there, and also geophysics. So there's a lot of different geophysical tools that archaeologists use to look at spaces. Some of them, like magnetometers, look at difference in magnetic resistance of stuff underneath. And not only are we finding that this is an artificial space, we're finding different features. Do y'all see these white markers?
Yeah.
So these big white markers arranged in rings show you the diameter of timber circles or post circles. that were once standing here over 3,000 years ago. I only have 2 of these areas marked. So you see a big post circle on this side of the road. It's about 200 feet in diameter. You see a smaller one right over there, about 60 feet in diameter. These are only 2 shown markers out of 36 timber circles that do exist inside the plaza. If I marked them all, it would get very confusing for a few reasons. They overlap each other. Do you think that all 36 were built at the same time?
No.
Probably not.
Exactly, right. So we see they're building, removing, and replacing these timber structures, one or maybe a few at a time, over a span of roughly 500 to 600 years. So we can date these structures because on the outsides of the post holes, we can find charred cypress fragments. And these are something you can do what with?
Carbon date.
Carbon date, exactly. Thank you, sir. I'm going to steal your cart. I will leave you with this for the time being. If it'll go. Oh, yeah. Okay. There we go. Put it in gear now. There we go. And we've excavated a few sections of these timber circles so far. And with the ground truth, we find that the post holes are really, really, really big. In some cases, 2.5 to 3 feet in diameter. So these are massive cypress timbers that are placed here and arranged in rings. We find them often buried 5 or 6 feet deep. So not only are they big, they're likely very tall. Archaeologists estimate that a post hole this deep could easily support a wooden pole that's 20 to 25 feet high, right, and be pretty stable. So I haven't told you anything about how ancient peoples used the plaza or these timber circles. Do you know why that is?
Don't know.
I really have no clue. This is a sort of space that archaeologists will call social, ceremonial, ritual. These are fancy words for saying, man, we don't see a lot of direct evidence for people using the space. They built it for special reasons. And we have these ceremonial areas around us today. Y'all ever been to a football stadium?
Yes.
Ever been to an auditorium?
Yes.
Saw your granddaughter's ballet recital or something like that? These spaces get periodically cleaned. You use them. Yeah, sometimes for sporting events, they fill up with trash and stuff. But you have janitorial staff, cleaners, come in and pick it up. Or in this case, maybe the inhabitants of the site, keeping their special spaces clean. We see that especially in the plaza and especially on the big mounds we're going to rediscover a bit later on. And so far, we haven't found a difference in any artifacts or dirt styles inside these timber circles as opposed to what's outside them yet. So what is new and emerging archaeology is the discovery of 2 buried mound-like features inside the plaza just in the last few years. So originally, we thought these were just timber circles that were oddly shaped because they're not perfectly circular like these things are. We found one right there out there behind you. It's not marked, but it's there. It's underneath the surface of the plaza. And we find one of these buried mound-like features over on the other side of the highway, kind of in the direction of where they're re-excavating over there. It turns out, based on sampling the dirt from these features, that they are not artificial. They're natural, but they're weird. They're full of hydrocarbons that are not present in the soil elsewhere in the site. Hydrocarbons suggest, in this case, natural gas. The most likely explanation, based on all the analysis so far, is that these are ancient mud volcanoes that were once active inside this plaza. If that is true, if we can determine they were active at the same time that people were here, it could have been a reason for them to pick this spot, to gather, create their community, and build a community around the central area where these 2 features once existed. It's also likely why we don't see any of the timber circles overlap or touch any of the mud volcanoes. So maybe these were ritual spaces to be used with these natural phenomenon. That's probably a good guess. It's one of the better ones I have. Yeah. But that'll get clear or more clear as we move forward. Questions right now?
How long has the excavation been going on?
Professionally or semi-professionally since 1913. If you're familiar with one of the early archaeologists, if you want to call him an archaeologist, he's kind of on the cusp there, C.B. Moore, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, he visited the site, did a lot of the first drawings of artifacts, and mapped the site. Now, the site was written about as early as the 1840s, in a journal, well, just someone's personal journal, not a scientific journal, you know. And he mentioned that he found an old Indian village with great profusion of artifacts strewn around the place. It must have been a lot of people living here or something to that effect. It was written about also in 1878. So, yeah, the site's got a long history of curiosity from later communities of people. And by the 1950s, things got really big and exciting here. That's when things professionally kick off, because the archaeologists discovered what surrounds the plaza, the ridges, which are hard to see. Do you see the taller grass? That makes out ridge number 1. It's all the way around us. It encircles us from the north, way over there, to the west, and to the south. The innermost ridge is about 2,000 feet in diameter. The outermost is 3/4 of a mile. They are not easy to see from ground level. That's why we keep the grass extra high on these ridges. So how do you think archaeologists found them? 1952 is when it happened. Do you have a guess? I don't know. It's good. That's a very honest answer. Not everyone's honest with ourselves. They used aerial photography. Or at least they got lucky. When archaeologist James Ford was sitting down at the Army Corps of Engineers HQ in Vicksburg, he came across these aerial photos and he said, "Whoa, what is this?" They popped out and he's like, "There's no way these are natural." And he's been to this site before. They knew all the mounds existed, but they didn't know about the largest of the earthworks. So this is Ridge 1, the first of 6 semi-oval or semi-elliptical ridges built by the ancient people. If you would stretch them out end to end, it would be 6.5 miles long. So that is a lot more dirt even than the creation of Mound A or the plaza, for instance. And we have a much better idea of what the ridges were used for, because we find the stuff that people left behind. Where do y'all keep your stuff that you leave behind?
Closets, cabinets, drawers.
Where are these
Safes.
closets, cabinets, drawers, and safes? In your homes. This hasn't changed in thousands and thousands of years. When you have valuables, you like to keep them in your home. And we still estimate that there's tens of millions of artifacts here. Over 90% are found on the tops, on the insides, and even underneath the ridges. So this was what housed the community. Now, we don't have a great sense of what the houses looked like. Archaeologists suspect they were small structures, maybe 20 feet in diameter. So we do see footprints that are roughly circular in shape, even if we aren't able to find all the post holes, which are not big like the ones inside the plaza, but much, much smaller. A lot of the time, we think that the homes were made of switch cane, which is a native bamboo. So they would build a frame of the cane, they would weave it together, and then cake the inside and the outside with mud or daub, creating the wattle and daub hut that you might imagine people lived in. So we find just tons and tons of stone artifacts, lots of projectile points, which were used to tip the spears and darts and knives of hunters back then. You find lots of plummets, which were very carefully hecked and ground iron ore objects that were used for fishing net weights. So they were doing a lot of fishing. We find stone hoes that were used for digging, but not for farming here, for gathering roots and tubers and other sorts of things from the swamps, floodplains, and woods. This place was constructed by hunters, fishers, and gatherers. And nowhere else in the world do you have potentially hundreds to thousands of people living in one space for hundreds of years, building the largest mounds in the continent. In a nutshell, that's what makes Poverty Point really special. And we just moved past ridge number 6. We'll come back through them later on in the tour as well. Got a couple mounds. You see Mount A to the right? That's the big one. Yeah. But we have a second one that's sneaking up on us. That's Mount E over here. I know it's not as impressive to look at, but it's about 150 years older than A. It was built around 1500 BCE. And at that time, it was one of the largest mounds in North America. So this really is the first time that native peoples are creating big monuments like this, made of earth. At least on this size and scale, okay? So we'll talk about older mounds later on in the tour. This mound covers about 2 acres, so 2 football fields roughly. And that's a lot of dirt if you want to stack it up 13 feet high. And that's what we see here with Mound E, which is big and flat, what archaeologists call a platform mound, okay? And when you look inside a mound, you most often see it's built in layers, right? They'll build for one season, they'll take a break, and then they'll come back and they'll put another layer. And you'll see a fairly clear line in many cases delineating these 2 different constructions and time periods, okay? So why do you think they built a big flat mound?
For survival.
For survival? Huh. I think that they built their houses for survival. But this mound, you don't find abundant artifacts in it. In fact, the mounds are even cleaner than the plaza. So you don't find evidence of workshops or houses like you do on the ridges. You don't find big structures like you do inside the plaza. You don't find important people or any people at all buried on the site, including in the mounds. So it's mysterious, right? Yeah. So we have to think about things in other ways. Because, sure, these mounds were likely used for religious purposes, ceremony and ritual, whatever that meant specifically to these ancient people. I just don't have any specifics. But here's something. You can fit thousands of people up there. A big flat mound tells us that it's for people to walk on, right? It's inviting, it's comfortable to stand, as opposed to something taller and pointier, right? That is not as easy to stand on at the top of Mount A, or at a pure conical mound that we're going to see later on. So the shapes of these monuments can give us some insight as to how people are using them. And I'll point this out later in the tour, but this is likely a place for people to stand on in preparation for a ritual march or parade, because we find a ridge that extends out towards us. You see this little part of the mound? It extends out and it crosses through this space and connects all the way to the plaza. So this is something we've got a better grasp on since we've really looked at LiDAR surveys back in like the mid-2000s or so. But there's a very serious connection from this mound to part of the plaza that we'll see later on. But useful, right? This is not an off-limits sort of mound. It's not that sort of ritual and ceremony. But you come over here and there's a lot going on. Mound A is big today. It's still the 2nd largest constructed monument in North America as far as something pre-Columbian, right, before Europeans arrived. But it's the single largest structure built by hunters and gatherers in the world, as far as all the archaeological studies confirm right now. Do you think it's impressive? After I told you that,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, probably so. But
Where did they have to bring the dirt from?
They would borrow it from different parts of the site. I'm going to point out a big borrow area from Mount A at the north end of things. Pardon
So
me,
is Mound A just that portion that's uncut there, or is it this
it's the whole thing.
this whole area?
From the lower platform
Okay.
to the cone to the ramp that connects the two. Howdy, folks. Y'all have a booklet?
Yes, we have a book.
Yeah. Make sure for the future to stay on the trail at all times. The trail takes you down to the base and up to the top. What's that?
Yeah, we went up there.
Okay. Gotcha. It protects the mound. Okay. I gotcha. Okay. Very, very good. But keep in mind that this is much more than just a pile of dirt, as I hope you're about to feel. So imagine you were here around 1350 BCE. That's about when Mound A was constructed, okay? Sometime over 3,200 years ago. Imagine you were a native person traveling from hundreds of miles away, bringing some of your raw materials with you to exchange with the peoples who lived here. You traveled not by foot, but likely by dugout canoe.
Yeah.
You would beach your dugout canoe at the eastern edge of the site where the Bayou Mason flows today. It's quite close to the visitor center. If y'all saw the Bayou Mason, the overlook, did you notice it's really steep? If you traveled by water, you wouldn't see anything at all until you hopped out of your dugout, took the walk up an earthen ramp, and stepped inside the plaza. And then everything would appear all at once. You would see the plaza before you. You would see the largest wooden structures you would have ever seen in your lives, the timber circles. You would see hundreds of wattle and daub huts on the tops of artificial ridges, and either hundreds or thousands of people, depending on the time of the year, maybe for big festivals and rituals and ceremonies that brought people here for big things. And beyond this, looking here, and that's not just a mound. That's your Burj Khalifa. That's the largest thing you would have ever seen in your entire life built by people. And that was true for you, and that was true for your kids, and that was true for your kids' kids for over 2,000 years. That's a sign of power, of wealth, and organization that not all of us even get to feel today. Has anyone here been to the Burj Khalifa? It's the largest building ever constructed in the world. This was that to them. This was that magnitude of power and wealth. And this is something that archaeologists call costly signaling theory. And it's easy to point this out because we still practice it. Why does someone build a skyscraper that big? They sure don't need it. Why does someone buy a Corvette instead of a Camry? I don't know. I would prefer the Camry. It's more useful. But whether or not you know it, when you wear a logo or a brand or an expensive shirt or have a Corvette or a BMW or something like this, you're signaling to other people you got something. And that's what this mound did for the people. Now, their ultimate intent was likely to create a religious structure, something to connect themselves to the sky or down below. But for others, they could see the power and they could feel it in that same way. That's 390,000 tons of earth. That is tremendous. And you would think by looking at it, it would take a long time to build. That's what archaeologists thought for a very long time, until the mid-2000s, when Dr. T.R. Kidder, who's doing more work with us this month, he did a couple big excavations here in 2005 and 2006, and a series of 88 soil cores. He looked at the dirt, and unlike the phases of construction we see in E, these big flat layers, they didn't see any. During the time this was built, they didn't see evidence of rain falling or plants growing on any construction floors. So they had the world's largest tarp. It'd have to cover 8 or 9 acres, okay, before they built it all at once. Y'all buy that? The thing with science is it has to be falsified. Right now, that is the knowledge as we see it, okay? We don't see any evidence to the contrary. So it makes it likely that it was built between 1 and 3 months' time. So not only was the largest thing built by hunters and gatherers like ever, it was also more quickly built than any other of these earthen monuments in the world. It shows us some big things. There's some big implications. You can't do this with just a few hundred people. You need maybe 10,000 folks coming together to put it up that quickly. So it shows that Poverty Point is the center of something big. And it's written not just in the type of materials that show up here from over 1,000 miles away, it's also written in the dirt itself. And it does something else really big for you. It strengthens your community. When you bring people together, it creates a shared purpose. And a lot of folks think it's even more important for the people coming together here to be part of this process because it strengthened their ties with people from all across the world. After the tour, y'all are very welcome to bring your vehicle. You can park it right here at the contact station, and you can take a hike down to the base of Mount A. There'll be an easy path and decking up to the top. Just remember to stay on the trail, where I might press it very gently.
Is that just normal erosion?
It is normal erosion. So to date, we haven't done any alterations to this mound, besides what we do archaeologically and then backfill those spaces. In the future, we may want to put some earthen veneers in order to better protect the mound. But we do so much archaeology, we try not to change anything that we can't make sense of. But whenever you build with earth, you're going to deal with erosion.
Yep.
And it's remarkable
Now,
that
this, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
would this have been a normal occurring plain in here with all the wooded area I see all the way around the perimeter of it?
Yeah.
Would this have been wooded in here too, or they don't know?
at the time, the environment was similar to today,
Okay.
but not exactly. This part of North Louisiana would have been more prairie-like,
Ah, okay.
but not completely. So whenever we do excavations, we can take pollen analysis from the dirt. So pollen is always collecting around us,
Sure.
and it gets buried at these ancient layers. So we still see all the woody species that you notice today, the oaks, the hickories, the sweet gums, the cypress. There's even a little bit of pine back then, which you don't see in this part of North Louisiana today. But we see a lot more grass species and species that exist in disturbed areas. Things like little barley, which was collected and eaten by people. Things like Chenopodium, which were another of these grass species that people ate at the time. Things that you don't see as much. And back in the 1950s, James Ford and Clarence Webb, who were two big archaeologists at the time, did a lot of work here. I'll mention them later. They thought that Mount A looked like a bird. They thought that if you looked at it from above, that you could see a bird flying into the west, which is out on our left. Do y'all see that? I guess y'all are looking at it from above. So that's a tough question. But most archaeologists today don't buy it. I'll leave it pretty simply. Have you ever done an ink blot test?
Yep.
You ever tried to make sense of a cloud?
Nope.
That's about what's going on. There are a lot of other clear effigy mounds in North America. Most of them are clustered in the upper Midwest and the Great Lakes region. Places like Iowa and Wisconsin have like hundreds and hundreds of these little effigy mounds. They don't look anything like this. I've not seen an effigy mound that looks like Mount A whatsoever. So it's a tough sell for me and most others in today's world. But you'll still see it mentioned a lot in archaeology, especially if you go back to papers of a few decades ago. We might see some wildlife out here if we're lucky. Last week I saw a bear on a tour, which is really cool. And you see deer all the time. Sometimes they peek out at us from the woods. If I see any, I'll let you know. We could see snakes. We could see raccoons. Later on in the day, you might see some armadillos. But no dice right now. Y'all notice the elevation is lower to the right-hand side? That's a borrow area. That's where dirt was taken, and this borrow area to the right specifically for Mound A, based on analysis so far. And the thing with erosion, it works two ways. Mounds get shorter, and big holes fill in over time. So these borrow areas are not going to be very significant to us by the naked eye, because they're about 3,000 plus years old. You can see Mound B coming up to the north. And it's nice to have scale. You see that big van? It shows you that Mound B today is about 20 feet high at its highest point. Probably 30 feet high when it was first built. That's going to be true for all these big monuments. Mound A, for instance, is 72 feet high, but when it was first built, it was likely 90 to 100 feet tall. And you have a big empty field before us that we keep more for deer. They like to have fawns and hide them in the tall grass. And we have, I'm thinking of the word. We have a BioBlitz survey coming up, and they're mostly focusing on butterflies, but biologists come up here and they do big surveys with us. This is one of the more active parts of the site for insects, believe it or not. But it's also potentially interesting for archaeology, because we learned that empty grassy fields like the one in the plaza are exciting. Starting in 2018 and 2019, archaeologists from Binghamton University in upstate New York began conducting geophysical surveys of this part of the site using magnetometers like we did inside the plaza, and using ground penetrating radars and a few different other techniques. They even did some seismic testing in some parts of the site for these field schools, and they found a series of anomalies in this field. But what happened in 2020, y'all?
Pandemic.
They haven't been back yet. So I don't know what's
I remember
happening.
the pandemic via the new normal when everything was shut down, from the lockdowns to mandates.
That's right.
I hope we never have to go through that again.
I hope not. But if we do, we'll just have to suck it up and do it.
Yeah.
It's happened before and it will happen again. In fact, the United States dealt with very similar issues in the early 20th century with the Spanish influenza, or Spanish flu.
Yeah.
They had a lot of people who wouldn't follow the mask mandates back then. And so there's some interesting documentation on that. People don't like discomfort in the Western world.
How large an area is the protected area these days?
I manage 470 acres. Yeah. It was purchased by the state of Louisiana and made into a state park in 1972. The original 400 acres was originally purchased by a tourism commission that fundraised and purchased the land, and then they sold it to the state. So kind of an interesting process. And just 2 years ago, we purchased an additional 68 or so acres. So that brings it up to 470. We did a 2-acre purchase in like 2005 or so, because there's a couple acres that came up for sale. And as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, especially the UN and the UNESCO committee likes it if you have additional buffer zone. So if land ever does come up available, we at least got a bid on it. We got to do our due diligence. Because has anyone visited the Cahokia site before, or other mound sites?
We've been to the Hopewell Culture
Gotcha.
in Ohio.
Well, that's a good example. A lot of those sites are right up against, communities.
Right.
So if you don't have buffer zones, communities can sometimes spring up. So that danger is very low at the site. It's good to have a buffer. But you have mound B here. And at this point, you've noticed each mound looks different. Each is unique. And I think they all had unique purposes. Why build a bunch of mounds with the same purpose when one will do? So what do you notice about the shape?
It's more symmetrical.
Yeah, it's got a circular base. Originally it was conical, but you see it's not a perfect cone today. There's a dip there. That is from archaeology in the 1950s, when James Ford and Clarence Webb and lots of other big names in archaeology at the time dug a trench through the middle of this mound over a couple years in different field seasons. It's not what we do today, but it was state of the art at the time, using a tractor with a scraper attached to the front, pushing through the mound with each scrape. It was cool, systematic for its time, right? You would see differences at levels underneath, identify different artifact styles at some layers deeper than the others, although it was really confusing for these archaeologists. Why do you think they chose this mound to dig instead of any of the others? Because this was just after they discovered the ridges. They had not come back to re-excavate a whole lot yet. They really started here. Not the big mound, not the plaza, not the ridges. The shape was speaking to them. Y'all been to Hopewell sites. If you see a conical mound at a Hopewell site, what does it tell you?
Probably something underneath.
Burials. By about the year 0, native peoples who belonged to the Hopewell cultural sphere began burying their dead in earthen mounds. And it's a practice that really spread throughout eastern North America. And they thought they would look at some burials into the faces of the people who built this construction. But then they didn't know how old it was yet. So they thought this was likely a very big Hopewell site. But it turns out it was not. They found very few artifacts. They didn't find the burials they were looking for. They didn't find evidence of big structures being built here or internal structures like you see inside some of these burial mounds later on. It was the beginning of change. They did find some charcoal fragments, and you can use C14 dating. That wasn't great back then, but even with their rudimentary techniques, they learned that this is the oldest mound ever discovered in North America. That was true from 1956 until 1996, when something big changed. Louisiana archaeologists began finding older and older mound sites here, with one of these places being 7,000 years old. This is no longer the first. It is part of a long tradition. Native peoples have been building these earthen monuments for at least 7,000 years. And I think they become part of a wide genetic memory within tribes and nations of today, because they still have stories to tell. People like the Choctaw, the Tunica, the Chickasaw, the Chitimacha, and these are just a few out of the southeastern tribes and nations. They all believe they come from the earth. And in many cases, their origin story, they come from the inside of a mound. So these mounds, these monuments, leave really, really big echoes that we're still learning to listen to today. And that's a big part of active archaeology, is reinterpreting these sites, using these big strings of connection. We won't ever know specifics, but we do see symbolism and colors of dirt and colors of objects. So red and white being the two big ones that don't change so much over time. You see that symbolism in a lot of the artifacts here. You also see a very serious belief in an underworld versus overworld kind of philosophy with watery spaces and native traditions in the East. And that's something people are still trying to figure out. Because Mound A, believe it or not, was built over a little swampy area. And so that swamp might have described the underworld, and the creation of the mound on top meant a connection between the overworld and the underworld, or something along those lines. Yeah. The thing is, I don't always buy a lot of these interpretations, because where do they come from? They come from people thousands of years into the future. It is a little bit difficult to put some of these beliefs back on these people. There's still some strings to find but you do have to take them with a grain of salt. So if you visit like places like Hopewell or later Mississippian sites, you're going to see a lot more of those interpretations, but here you'll see a lot fewer.
You've been to Ocmulgee too.
Yeah, that's a Mississippian site. Did y'all see the Birdman at Ocmulgee? He's a cool little figurine made of copper.
So these people were hunter-gatherers. Did they grow any kind of crops at all?
Not to my knowledge.
Anybody
Haven't
found?
haven't seen any evidence yet, and that's not surprising here. In Louisiana, the native peoples did not adopt agriculture, at least, I mean, not even a little bit, till 500 to 700 AD or CE, and it wasn't like big time until after the year 1000. They used agriculture more as a supplement than as the big deal, unlike peoples of the Midwest and further into like Georgia, for instance, at Ocmulgee. They're bigger into the maize agriculture. Here it's never really popular. And notice the taller grass, we've re-entered the ridges. Just crossed over ridge number 6, we're now 5. They're gonna get a lot more clear after we cross the highway. And if you take this ride with me, but 3,000 plus years ago, you would see hundreds of wattle and daub huts at the top of ridges that were several feet taller because of lack of erosion. You would hear all kinds of weird languages. A lot of archaeologists suspect that these were multicultural folks because of the wide exchange network. So it wasn't just necessarily one tribe or group of people here at any one time. Even the year-round inhabitants. You would see hunters coming in from the woods to the north with white-tailed deer or a big bear hung up on a litter. You would see fishermen or fisherwomen coming up from the bayou over there bringing in catches of fish. You would see gatherers coming in from the swamps over here, woodland over there, behind us, bringing in all kinds of different fruits during the summer, like pawpaws, persimmons during the fall. They could be getting lots of roots like lotus root or cattail root for starches. And we do see some evidence for that in hearths and cooking pits. These sorts of phytoliths tell the story of what kind of starchy foods people are eating. Also lots of nuts, especially during the fall, focusing on hickory nuts and pecans, but also acorns. And I didn't mention anything domesticated, because we don't find it in the archaeological record yet. But check out how big these ridges are. You can see them working over there. Some ridges in this part of the site are still 6 feet high today, which is impressive. Imagine them a couple feet higher originally. But then, imagine the cool part is what's underneath the ridges here themselves. And it's still a picture we're trying to get a better sense of. Over a several acre space, and we haven't yet mapped how big it is yet, ancient people filled in what is likely an ancient gully with 8 to 10 feet of dirt, creating that as a foundation for ridges built on top. So they're looking into some of these things at these excavation units on the north ridges. We have one unit that was excavation unit that wrapped up there. We have a couple more in the woods. And those in the woods up there could be very telling, because in 1983 there was a big excavation right in front of us, and they found over 20 feet of artificially placed soil underneath that part of the site. So it did not matter what the natural world looked like to these folks. when they had an image in mind, they moved the world to complete it. And that's another big thing to remember. And I think it's a big part of the impact that you can still feel at Poverty Point, is that if you were an outsider, you entered this place for the first time, you left the natural world behind, and you entered something that was completely man-made. And that's an experience that no one else could claim thousands of years ago. There's a lot of signs that point to Poverty Point as the absolute center of culture for the entire Archaic period in North America. It's the only place that we find at least 16 different styles of projectile points, so spanning all kinds of different cultural traditions. We're getting better at sourcing the different stones. So one of the archaeologists in the crew with us uses mass spectroscopy in order to better source materials, because it turns out we're really bad at doing it with the naked eye. Even geologists are. So we found some pieces of Knife River flint recently, which come from close to the Canadian border, like Montana kind of area. That's where you find that sort of flint. So our exchange area is getting bigger and bigger over time. Some of the copper comes from the Appalachians. Some of the copper comes from the Great Lakes. They weren't really picky on wherever the copper came from, just that it got here. It's very cool. And that's all from analysis within the past couple years. Both the stones and the copper. It's just going to get better. Welcome back to the plaza. Wave goodbye to the people on the ridges. See y'all later. Ancient and current people. You have one more mound from the Poverty Point period. I know it's not as impressive, but as you notice, it's the only one inside the plaza. It was set aside for some reason, and the mound was the last thing that was built here. Underneath the mound itself are 16 very thin, very flat floors. They were not built as mounds, but specialized zones for ritual and ceremony, for lack of a better word. This mound was last excavated in 2011 when Dr. Tony Ortman wanted to better understand what people were using the surfaces for. So he excavated into them. He scraped the surface of each of the floors for micro artifacts and soil analysis. And he said, well, it doesn't look like it's domestic use, because what we're seeing is not what we would see inside the ridges, okay? And that's kind of where he left us. We do not have a complete report from that 2011 field season. So we poke him every 6 months to get a little bit more info. But I think it would probably be good to do a little bit more re-excavating here. And that's what these archaeologists are doing. They're digging into units or digs that were previously done in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, because their techniques were not always good. Their methods were worse. Their record keeping was even worse than that. So we can go back in, get a better sense of what's actually there, and then use modern sampling techniques. So they're doing a lot of soil analysis. They're getting fresh radiocarbon dates. They're getting fresh luminescence dates and all these sorts of things to make our picture a lot cleaner.
When they close a site, then after they've been excavating in there, how do they do that? Do they put the soil back in as they took it out?
You can never put it back.
No. Yeah,
that's why we're super careful, and we usually re-excavate. Instead of digging something fresh, we find the old scars and we dig that up.
Okay.
Because every time you dig, you destroy what you study. Mm-hmm. And with archaeology, that has become more and more unethical over time. Especially when tribes and nations do not have the best relationship with archaeology, because these folks really did loot some graves for over 100 years. Yeah. So we got to be a little bit more careful with how we do it, so as to not destroy this sort of story, because our techniques are just going to get better. You see that little ridge across the way? You see that pedestrian crossing sign and that hump?
Yes.
That is part of that ridge that comes from Mound E. It's called the Mound E Ridge. It starts at the big flat mound, comes over this way, and I know it doesn't look like it, but it does cross the highway and meets up right here. So these big spaces, these special floors, were likely connected to Mount E for some kind of parade or ritual. So you would group up one of the two places, do whatever you're going to do, and then follow that ridge for some kind of procession. That's as good of a guess as any.
So why is this site designated what's it, UNESCO site?
Yeah. I don't know. Why do you think?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure about what the designation really means.
It means that the site is not just important for the local community or the country, but internationally. That the story being told here has big implications for who we are as people. And this is a cultural designation. There's also natural and scientific designations as well. So places like the Grand Canyon are UNESCO World Heritage Sites too. Places like the Everglades, that's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. But you get cultural ones like this one. Of course, you know Stonehenge, you know the pyramids, you know Machu Picchu. So when the story is so important that it's international, you got to work for it though. It was a 7-year process of nomination.
Probably a pretty lengthy process.
And it's very political.
Really?
Yes. And remember, y'all can hike up to Mount A after the tour, so I'm going to point out the path over there. But it'll be very easy to see once you get to the base of the mound. And you'll park at marker number 3.
The area they're working in up there is there, what's the significance of that?
Increasingly, a lot.
Yeah.
That is the top of what I described at Mount A, where you enter the site for the first time. That's the top of what archaeologists call the duck. So there is an earthen ramp below that there's more signs all the time that we think is fully artificial. And that part is super artificial at the top. They created a ridge to obscure view of the site until you cross it. So they're about to backfill it pretty soon. But the hole goes like 3 meters deep. Maggie, how deep is that unit?
Right now, or has it ever gotten?
Right now.
Right now, it's about 2 meters deep.
2 meters. Okay. Thank you so much.
No problem.
So it's about 2 meters deep. That's Dr. Maggie Spivey, and she is a professor at Outer Coast College in Alaska. So she's brought her students along with Dr. T.R. Kidder from Washington University, St. Louis for these re-excavations. So that hole is 2 meters deep, and that means that's 2 meters of artificial dirt. It's about 7 feet. So when you're down there, it's a little spooky. But that's how we get a view of the ancient world.
Now, is that another mound there, or is that just something?
That is a mound.
Okay.
And until 2000, we thought it was part of the complex. And it is, and it isn't. It was just not built by the original people. So between 700 and 1100 AD or CE, another mound was built belonging to the Coles Creek culture. So they built their mound at the very edge of this ancient site. And the site was still ancient for them back then. It's not that old. 1,300 years old at most, right? And you can see their mound, and you can see 2 markers on the top. Those are grave markers, both from 1851. It turns out later Euro-Americans would bury their dead on ancient mounds too. This was not an isolated practice. The 2 other mound sites closest to us, which are just 1.5 miles that way and 2 miles that way, they both have historic cemeteries from about the same period. And that is true all throughout the lower Mississippi Valley. It is not nice. It's not something that people should do today, right? But it's now become part of the historical record. Why do you think they would do it?
Well, it's a raised elevation, so
Yeah, above the water table. Yeah, you don't want your ancestors floating back up to you. Thank you all for joining me on this tour.
Well,
You're
thank you.
welcome.
Thanks, Ryan.
Do y'all have questions right now?
When you went to Hopo Culture,
Uh-huh.
a lot of that has been destroyed by pig farming. and
Yes.
Basically digging the mounds and leveling them. Did much of that happen to this area?
It did, but not to the same degree. By the 1840s, a plantation was established here. A plantation that was named Poverty Point. That's where the site name comes from. And at that time, they started plowing lots of the plaza, and they started plowing lots of the ridges. So the central space here and a lot of the ridges were disturbed by the plowing. Now, the plows only went so deep. They only went 20 to 30 centimeters deep. So sometimes under a foot. So everything below that was fairly well preserved, which is good. Now, it does hurt our story a little bit because the last people who lived here, we're not sure exactly when that is or when the Poverty Point period completely cuts off, but we've stopped finding radiocarbon dates at around the 1100 BCE mark. But yeah, that is part of things here too. And even with that, this is one of the best preserved sites in all of North America. Yeah, rural spaces can help protect places.
Yeah.
Thank y'all so much for joining.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome, sir. Thank you for the good tour.
Tell you really like your job.